All right, I'm going to do a quick lecture here for you guys about what the Enlightenment is, kind of a general overview in case you're still a little confused. And then we're going to start getting into the nitty-gritty of the specific philosophers. So to get started, you'll notice the Enlightenment is a time period. You can immediately tell that if you look up here because you see a period of time listed here, the 1600s to the 1700s. Sometimes you might see 1500s to the 1700s, or you might see it go all the way up to the early 1800s. It's difficult to pinpoint an exact time because just like with the scientific revolution, it's not like somebody woke up one day and said, oh, the Enlightenment has started, let's get going. Now, one difference, though, from the scientific revolution is that the people of the time did actually name it the Enlightenment. They felt that they were becoming enlightened. So I actually find it's kind of helpful to think about the word enlighten when I try to remember what this time period is, because enlighten means to get greater knowledge, and that's exactly how the men at this time. Here's some of them right here. That's exactly how they felt. They thought that they were gaining greater knowledge, and that using this greater knowledge, they could make the world a better place, a happier place. So one of the things that we can start with here is I think you'll notice we have lots of dudes up here, some of them with really weird hair. Over here, these guys, these are some of the thinkers of the scientific revolution. And I put them on here because I don't think we can underestimate how important the scientific revolution is when we're talking about this. And excuse my terrible handwriting, and I'll excuse yours. So the scientific revolution is hugely important here. Just as a little reminder, the scientific revolution was a time when, starting kind of in the 1500s with Copernicus, when Europeans, scholars specifically, started to try to understand their physical world using science the way we do today. And that seems like nothing all that revolutionary. It doesn't seem that exciting. But you have to understand that at the time, if you wanted to know an answer to something, if you wanted to understand the world, the place you'd probably go would either be a book by some, Greek philosopher or Roman philosopher, or you would look at the Bible. And those were you went with tradition and what you knew. During the scientific revolution, people like Copernicus and Galileo and Isaac Newton start to question that way of getting information. They start to say, well, maybe we could experiment. Maybe through observation and reason, we could understand our physical world, such as the universe and gravity and some of the other things we talked about in class. Well, this is important because these ideas are going to inspire these guys, the Enlightenment philosophers, or philosophes, for those that were from France. They also decide to use observation and reason. They also decide to use observation and reason. But instead of using it to understand their physical world, they want to use it to understand society, to understand humanity. What makes people people? They wanted to use their enlightened abilities, that knowledge that they are growing with and learning, in order to make the world a better place. So I want to start by mentioning this guy, Francis Hutcheson. Francis was born in 1694 in Scotland, and he's worth mentioning for a couple reasons. One, he points out, not he specifically, but he's a good example of the fact that when we talk about the Enlightenment, a lot of times we think about it as like one huge movement that happened all over Europe, right? But it really didn't happen all over Europe. I mean, it did, but it wasn't one singular movement. Really, if you notice on this, you'll notice all these little marks here, right? For example, right here, here's Edinburgh, that's in Scotland, that's where Hutcheson was. He's really considered the father of the Enlightenment in Scotland, for example. John Locke might be considered the father of the Enlightenment in England. You have different men and a couple women that are going to bring Enlightenment ideas all over Europe. So it's almost really actually lots of different Enlightenments going on at one time as the ideas kind of spread from one place to the other. So that's one reason I want to mention him. The other reason I want to mention him is he has a quote that I just think is perfect to mention going forward with this unit on the Enlightenment. He often spoke about what he called the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And please try not to mock my handwriting too much because I know it's terrible. What he meant by that, well, he was referring to society and the idea that using enlightened ideas, using observation and reason and an attempt to understand our world, we could actually create a society where you had the greatest happiness for the greatest number. As we move forward, I want you guys thinking about this. We talked about this last week, but Mrs. Hinder and I are going to be expecting that in about 2 weeks, we want you guys to be able to engage in an enlightened coffee house. A coffee house that we're going to kind of recreate that will be very similar to what would have happened during the Enlightenment. And we're going to ask you guys this question. So we are going to be asking you guys to answer the question. Let's see if I can shrink this guy down. Was he right? Was Hutcheson right? Can we create a society where most people are happy? Now, you're probably thinking like, well, of course you can't make a society where everyone's happy. So I think we can all kind of agree to that. I mean, maybe not. Maybe you really are an optimist and you think we could. I think more specifically or more broadly, we're asking you guys, generally speaking, is he right? Is Hutcheson right? Can we create, using reason and thought, a society that has the greatest happiness for the greatest number? So that's what I really want you, like the big context I want you to be thinking about as we move forward with this lecture. So let's do a quick overview of last week. You guys might recall that last week, Mrs. Hinder and I did some awesome acting for you guys, and we were these two guys. You had Mr. Hobbes over here, Thomas Hobbes, born in 1588, and that is who Mrs. Hinder was being. So if you remember her being an angry pessimist, right, angry. She didn't trust the world. She wore black, right? She was the goth. And then you have John Locke, and that's who I was, right? All hippie and happy. The world is a great place, and we shall all be trusted and love one another. Their views of humanity were very different. I'm making a joke of it. They were very serious men. But John Locke, if you recall from our discussions, he felt like people's hearts are good, right? If people were not put in bad situations, generally speaking, people want to make the right decisions. They want to do what's right and good. And with good information, they'll make good decisions. Thomas Hobbes is going to say the opposite. He's going to say we're very selfish people. And we really can't be trusted. And so they have very different views then of what would make a society that's the happiest for the most people, right? Going back to our friend Mr. Hutcheson from the last page. What they're both really known for. Thomas Hobbes, aside from his ideas that we're selfish and we have to be protected from one another, he comes up with this idea of social contract. And other people like Rousseau, that we're going to talk about later, are going to take this and turn it into more of what we think of as the modern idea of it. But this idea that we give up some of our rights to a government in exchange for protection. Now, his version of social contract would say we give up really almost all of our rights to an absolute monarchy because really the only right we're guaranteed is life. And that the monarch will protect us, keep us safe from one another because we are all very selfish on the inside and will make decisions that will best suit us without a government there to protect ourselves from one another. John Locke is known most for his ideas about natural rights. And these typically sound very familiar to people, to students, because you've heard of life, liberty, and you guys have typically heard pursuit of happiness. But he argues for property. That these are rights that all people deserve. Keep in mind the very different worlds that the two of these grew up in. John Locke grew up at a time of when he was older, he actually witnessed what was basically a bloodless coup, where there was a shift in government power and no one was really hurt. Whereas you have someone like Thomas Hobbes, who was there when Charles I was actually beheaded, as people tried to revolt against the government. So as a result, they both have different ideas of humanity, and they also both have very different ideas about what the right kind of government is. John Locke's going to vote for democracy, and a democracy whose specific purpose is to protect our fundamental rights of life, liberty, and property. Thomas Hobbes, on the other hand, social contract. Give up your power to a monarch, and then that monarch will protect you from each other. Now we move on to our next philosopher, a new guy that we haven't talked about yet. And his name is Montesquieu, or he's just referred to as Montesquieu because his actual name is like Charles Louis de Second Baron de la Brede, I can't even say it. So it's Montesquieu. We're just going to call the guy Montesquieu. He is French, whereas Locke and Hobbes are both English. So when you're going back to that idea of that map that we were looking at before, here, let me pull that up. You've got, right, Hutcheson here. We have Locke and Hobbes coming out of London. And then now we have Montesquieu, who is going to be coming out of France. We have quite a few very important philosophers or philosophes in France. So Montesquieu, born in 1689, and he is famously known for something that I think most of you guys should find pretty familiar, which is the idea of separation of powers. So separation of powers is what we would call a political theory. In fact, most of these are pretty much all political theories. It's a theory of, again, how can we make a society where everybody is happy? And Montesquieu is definitely going to tend towards Locke in that people have fundamental rights, and one of the best ways we can have a happy society is to protect people's fundamental rights. And he argued that there's so much corruption and so much, what he would have used the term like despotism, which is kind of like the idea of powerful rulers with way too much control over the people, who then take advantage of their power and then create unhappy people. So he argued that for a political theory, a way to solve this problem was to have separation of powers. And you might recall this idea from 8th grade, where, for example, in our country, we have 3 branches. So in our country, we have 3 branches of government. And the reason we have 3 branches of government is because our founders agreed with Montesquieu on this. Montesquieu argued that if you take the government, we'll make a big, this will be the government, right? And you take this government who has control, this guy's going to be our government, okay? You take the government, and if you split the government in half, or in multiple parts, however many parts you want to split it up into different branches, that you can separate the power, and then there's no one area of the government that has too much power and then can take advantage of the people and not give them their fundamental rights. So in our government, in the United States, we have Congress, which is our legislative branch. Right? We have, we'll say the Supreme Court, which is a judicial branch. And then we have the presidency, which is the executive branch. Many constitutions around the world have made use of Montesquieu's ideas of separation of powers, that in order to prevent corruption and people's rights being taken advantage of, you can divide the government up into into multiple different branches. Not everybody has 3. Some people have 2. Some people have 5. Different countries do different things. But the overall idea of separation of powers, is incredibly important in many, many countries. And, of course, most importantly to us, it's very important in our own country. And now we have a guy whose actual name was François-Marie Arouet. He was French. I'm sure I just totally butchered his name. But we just call him Voltaire. That's what his pen name was. Some people throughout history have used names other than their own for writing for many reasons. So he went by Voltaire. He is known for many, many things. He wrote a number of very famous books. The thing that we are going to focus on that affects our culture especially, and really many other cultures, but we tend to care about our own more for whatever reason, is freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and separation of church and state. These probably sound very familiar to you, because these are all ideas that you find in our own government. In fact, you find that all 3 of these can be found basically in the very first amendment of our Constitution. Separation of church and state is arguably not quite in there. Jefferson wrote about it. Many of our founders wrote about it. It's actually never specifically anywhere in our Constitution, although in the First Amendment, it does give people freedom of religion. And so many people read into that, saying that that's where you find separation of church and state, or you can just read many of our founders and see it there. Voltaire was a famous wit. He wrote in almost every form that you could imagine. He wrote plays, he wrote poems and novels and essays and historical and scientific works. He wrote a lot of satire, which is he would write plays and stories that were actually making fun of society at the time. He made fun of the Catholic Church quite a bit, and this was a pretty dangerous time to be doing that. There were a lot of censorship laws that prevented people from outright coming out and criticizing, especially the church, and so he would write these satires and make fun of it, but not overtly. It was supposed to be funny, but he often got himself into trouble as a result. So he was very critical, again, of government overreaching and government not respecting people's individual rights. And he argued that in any society that's going to respect people's rights, you have to give people the freedom to follow whatever religion they want, the freedom to express themselves, and the best thing you could do is keep the church out of government. Because remember, he grew up at a time where the Catholic Church had become incredibly corrupt and was controlling many governments throughout Europe. And so his experience led him to believe that it was best to create a government that didn't do that. And our founders agreed with Voltaire for the most part. They created a government that was based on these exact same things. So the question you have to ask yourself, so is this the way that people are happy? Is this how we create a society that's happy? Do we make sure people have freedom? Is that the most important? Or do we go back to John Locke and say, we just life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? Or do we talk about Montesquieu? And separation of powers is about just preventing government from having too much power? Or is it all of these things combined? This is the really critical and tough question that we're asking you guys to consider as we move forward. So the next guy on our tour of super awesome Enlightenment thinkers is a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, born in 1712. Took me a minute to remember there. Born in 1712, died in 1778. Rousseau was very critical of Thomas Hobbes, arguing when Thomas Hobbes argued that people are wicked and bad, Rousseau really was more on John Locke's side. He felt that just in nature, the natural state of things is for there to almost be a natural morality, that none of us wants to get hurt. We don't want our lives at risk. We don't want our things stolen, and we don't And so then we don't do those things to other people, that there's a natural law to the world that is good. What he's most known for, or what we're going to focus on him being known for, is actually a more updated version of the social contract, that even though he was very critical of Thomas Hobbes, he is going to add to the idea of social contract that Thomas Hobbes originally put out. So Rousseau is, one of his famous phrases is that man is born free, but he is everywhere in chains. He asserted that modern states take away people's physical freedom, and they don't do anything to help protect our basic civil freedoms. So he argued that legitimate political authority, almost like flipping Thomas Hobbes' idea of social contract on the other side, he argued that political authority only comes from the citizens basically agreeing to be governed. So under Thomas Hobbes, he would say, okay, well, you give your rights to the king, right? And because the king has all the political power, and then he can protect you. Rousseau kind of switches this around, and he says, the power really comes from the people, all right? These are all little tiny people. We are the people. I'm going to shrink this down a little bit and give myself some room. And that the people actually are the ones that hold the power, because they are the ones that give the right to whoever is their government, whether that is a king. All right, we'll put a little crown to represent a king. Adorbs. Whether that's a king or whether that's a system like our own government, which I'm not really sure how I would show that. Here. There's a little flag. In either case, he would argue that whether it's a king or a democracy or whatever kind of government you have, that there exists a social contract, an agreement, not actually written down, but an understanding that the power comes from the people, and they are giving the right to a government to tell them what to do. That a government doesn't just by birthright, because God says that you have the power over people, that you get to have that power. That's not the way that it actually works. That instead, the only way a government can control people is if they let it. And that's the social contract. People allow the government to control them. And in exchange, the government then creates a system that is safe for people and protects their fundamental rights. Another man that I want to bring up is a guy whose name is Adam Smith. And he is a little different than some of the other people that we've talked about. Rousseau and Locke and Montesquieu and Hobbes were all mostly concerned with government and the type of government that is going to create the happiest society. Adam Smith is a little bit more concerned with what we call economics, right? Wealth. And where wealth goes, how wealth is distributed, how people gain access to wealth, and how they spend their wealth is basically what economics is. Adam Smith was born in 1723 and died in 1790. So he was around during the American Revolution. However, he is Scottish. So when I think of Adam Smith, he's kind of weird to me because he's almost a mix between Thomas Hobbes in the way he views humanity, but he fits in with the other philosophers more because he's very much in favor of freedom. So let me explain this a little bit more. Adam Smith, and he's often called the father of modern-day economics, he argued that the best thing that you could do to create a happy society is to basically have what you would call like a free market. The fancy term that people often use for this is what they call, it's actually, it's worth knowing because people refer, our government, they refer to it as a laissez-faire economics system. So the major impact that Adam Smith has, which is huge, is to change the way economics is done in European nations, and the United States is going to follow what European nations end up creating. Prior to this idea of laissez-faire economics, which is the government kind of stays out of it, because they call it a free market, that if I want to sell things to somebody, I can sell things to people. If they want to sell goods and resources to me, I can buy those resources from them. And generally speaking, the government stays out of it, with the exception of maybe taxing it here or there. Well, before that, there was this idea called mercantilism, which is basically like the economic equivalent of an absolute, like political absolutism, right? Where like the government has total control, except in this case, we're talking about the government having control over the nation's economy for the purpose of trying to beat other countries. So it's out of this that you get like really like countries going and exploring and trying to exploit the resources of other nations because they're trying to compete with those other nations. The mercantilism then gets replaced by this idea of a free market instead. We'll get more into this because this is pretty complicated stuff. When we start talking about economics, I think it's a little bit trickier to understand than some of the other political stuff. I think you're less familiar with it and you haven't heard about it as much. So we'll be getting more into it. At its basics, when we're trying to go back to this idea of happiness and what makes a happy society, what we want to really look at, and the question you should be asking yourself here is, does it make people happiest if we let companies and people spend their money however it is that they want to spend their money, or are there bad sides to that as well? And how do we measure those things? And like I said, we'll be getting more into that later. So the last individual I want to mention is a woman named Mary Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft was born in 1759 in England, and she was a writer and a philosopher, and specifically she argued for women's rights. I want to make sure I mention her because this was a time when not a lot of women were given the opportunity to be educated, nor was it at all societally acceptable for them to be involved in politics and philosophy. So the fact that she is a pretty big deal. So definitely what she's known for is women's rights. She made a really dramatic claim at the time in her writings where she suggested that women are not naturally inferior to men, but they only seem like it because they have a lack of education. She suggested that both men and women should be treated as rational beings. And she imagined that you could create a society or a social order, again, that was focused on reason. And that if it was focused on reason, that women's rights made a whole lot of sense. And again, you'd have a happier society. Half of your society would be much happier if they were able to basically be treated as equal. And the other half of society would benefit from what women had to offer society. So, again, a lot of these ideas that we've been talking about may not seem that dramatic in the context of today. So you have to kind of put aside what you know about today or what you think you know about how the world should work and instead think about it from their perspective and based on what they knew at that time period. So I'm going to go back to this idea this one last time and ask you to really think about happiness. And specifically, to try your best to put yourself in the mindset of a philosopher. And anybody can be a philosopher. All being a philosopher means is that you question your world and you try to understand it. And Mrs. Hinder and I, we just want you guys to do that. We want you to engage your minds and start thinking about how do we build a society and can we build a society where people are happy, and use those Enlightenment ideas to try to answer that question. All right, so you should have filled out that chart as you were going that you were given by me. before working on this. If you have gaps in it, you should go back and listen at the beginning of the video. If you just have listed people's names and the dates, and you've just written down social contract but given no other details, that is an example of you not being a self-sufficient learner, and you need to go back and you need to add to it and listen again. All right, good luck, guys. Bye.